As always, thanks for tuning in to the View from a Hearse podcast. You're about to hear part 2 of a 2-part interview with Steve Dugan. If you have not listened to the previous episode, number 121, I encourage you to go back and listen to that before continuing with this. We'll pick up from the previous episode as Steve begins to talk about his relationship with Congressman Jack Brinkley and later the turn of events in his life, and how a former president of the United States gave him the gift of significance when he needed it the most. The stories are rich, and the life lessons are even richer. So let's pick it up.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.
If you'd have stayed with Jimmy Carter as a chance and worked for that campaign, you'd have been part of his administration. Your buddies Hamilton Jordan and Jody Powell, who you were hanging out with and knew them well, they were certainly part of the administration. There's a good chance you would have been part of a presidential administration. Don't you agree?
I think if I had gone to work in the campaign for him, I can't imagine that President Carter, being as nice to me as he always was, would have had me work in the campaign and not offered me a job in his administration.
So the interesting thing, you mentioned that you met Carter and Jack Brinkley. Jack Brinkley, folks, was a very popular congressman here in Georgia in the 3rd District that actually we lived in Fort Valley, and where I lived in Reynolds. Very well known. You met him at the same time you met Jimmy Carter, and boy, your relationship with him was interesting too. You ended up working for him, a real job in Washington, but just talk about how that came about with Congressman Brinkley.
When I went to work for Jimmy Carter in '66 in that campaign, he told me I was going to be his teenage campaign manager, but he didn't tell me what to do. And I was there every day at the headquarters, so I had a chance to figure out what I wanted to do, and they let me do whatever I wanted to do. And what I came up with was this simple idea. My idea was, if we can get young people, teenagers around Georgia, enthusiastic about Jimmy Carter, then they will tell their mom and daddy about it. And children, teenagers especially, can exert a lot of influence on parents. I mean, if you have 2 teenagers and they say, we're all excited about Jimmy Carter, please vote for Jimmy Carter, it's pretty hard for the mom and daddy to come home from voting and say, well, we voted for somebody else. So I figured if we can get the kids enthusiastic for Jimmy Carter, that'll exert influence on the parents. And so what I did is I came up with this letter introducing Jimmy Carter to young people, and then I attached this form. I asked them to give me the name and address of 10 of their friends and mail it back to me in Atlanta. And when those things would come in, I'd send the letter out to those 10 people, and then I'd send all the people I had the names and addresses of a newsletter every week. Well, by the end of the campaign, wherever Jimmy Carter went, people were coming up to him and saying, you know, my son or my daughter is in this Teenagers for Carter thing. And so Carter thought that was good. It gave him a good introduction to a lot of people he didn't know. So anyhow, the word about that must have gotten around to other politicians, because the next summer, it might have been summer of '67 or '68, Congressman Brinkley, who did get elected to Congress in 1966, he called me and he wanted me to work for him, setting up a similar thing for him. So that was called either Brinkley Advice Clubs or Congress Clubs. And what I did is I went around to all the high schools in the district and met with any kids that were interested in politics and formed at their high school one of these Brinkley Advice Clubs. We ended up with a lot of young people, and they would meet and they would vote on what was most important to them. And then I would report to Congressman Brinkley what these people were interested in. And he would put something in the congressional record about it, or make a speech about it, or try to do something about it. In fact, there was one issue that came up that the Congress clubs, the Brinkley Vice clubs, brought to Congressman Brinkley's attention, and he really got the policy changed to the federal government changed to go along with what the kids in these clubs wanted to do. And that made the kids feel like they were real important. And it gave Congressman Brinkley good contact with their parents, because that was his first term. So I did that for him. Then, after I got out of college, I got drafted into the Army. And my daddy while I was in the Army, we found out he had terminal cancer. And I was in the Army, but I was about to get out, and I wanted a job near where Mom and Daddy lived in Fort Valley. And I didn't know what job to get. But one day I was we had these formations at lunchtime every day, and we had an hour to ourselves. And one day I'm in that lunchtime formation, and I thought, you know what? I'll call Congressman Brinkley and ask him if he could help me get a job. So when they gave us an hour for lunch, I went to a payphone and called Washington, got his number at his office and called, and I told him, I said, can I talk to Congressman Brinkley? And they said, just a minute. And luckily he was there, and he said he would talk to me. And I told him what was going on and that I was looking for a job. And he said, call me back tomorrow at this same time. So the next day I called him back, and he said, I'm going to let you be my research assistant, and you're going to work out of my office in Warner Robins. He says, so when you get out of the Army, you come to Warner Robins and you'll start being my research assistant. And the office was in the City Hall in Warner Robins. So that's how I got to working for him full time. And I worked for him for a couple of years in Warner Robins, and then he got some bad advice. I made a lot of speeches back then, had a little TV show on the cable channel in Warner Robins, and somebody told Congressman Brinkley they thought I was going to run against him. Well, it was the furthest thing from my mind. But he called me one day and said, I don't want you to work in Warner Robins anymore. I want you to come to Washington and be the counsel on the Veteran Affairs subcommittee that I'm the chairman of. And I said, but Congressman, we just bought a house here. Julie's about to have a baby. I don't want to move to Washington. And he says, well, I don't want you to be in Warner Robins. And then I got the feeling that I didn't think he was wanting me to come to Washington. I thought he just wanted to get me out of Warner Robins. So I didn't do it. And then later, a few months later, I was working at a bank in Warner Robins, and I got a call one night from Mac Mattingly, who was the chairman of the Republican Party in Georgia. And he said the Republicans were looking for somebody to run for Congress from the 3rd District, and did I want to do it? Well, I did. I always dreamed of being a congressman, but I didn't want to run against Congressman Brinkley. But here, Mac Mattingly called and gave me this opportunity, and I said that I would. And he said, well, we'll raise the money for you. We'll hire you a campaign manager and everything. So I started doing that, and I remember I had to go to Columbus to have a meeting with these 10 real rich Republican boosters who were going to pay for my campaign. And I went over there that night to that meeting, and these 10 real rich Republicans had an easel, and they pulled it off the cloth in front of the easel, and it was a full-page ad they had already bought to be in the Columbus Ledger-Enquirer the next Sunday. And the headline on the ad said, Jack Brinkley has failed. And it was just a list of things where they thought Jack Brinkley had failed. And then at the bottom it said, in little print, elect Steve Dugan to Congress. And I looked at those guys and I said, you know what? Congressman Brinkley hadn't failed. I said, I'm not running because I think he failed. I'm just running because I want to be a congressman. I think I'd be a good congressman. But you're not running that ad. You're not putting my name on an ad saying Congressman Brinkley failed. You're just not going to do it. I won't let you. And they said to me, if you don't let us put this ad in the paper, we won't give you a penny. You won't have a penny for your campaign. I said, well, I sure will miss your money, but you're not going to run that ad about Congressman Brinkley. You're not going to have me saying that he failed because it just isn't true. And they said, well, you'll never see any of our money. And I said, well, I sure will miss it. Nice to know you. Goodbye. And I left. Now, this is the way God works. What I didn't know was of those 10 men, one of them was not a Republican. One of them was pretending to be a Republican. He was a very rich man, and he was a spy for Congressman Brinkley. So he went back and told Congressman Brinkley that I refused to take the money if they made me say anything bad about him. I shouldn't have ever run. It was another dumb thing I did, just like the two dumb things I did with Jimmy Carter by letting him down. I should have never run, but at least I wouldn't let people use my campaign to be unfair to Congressman Brinkley, and he had a spy in there. And so after that election, the bank wouldn't give me a job back, and nobody would give me a job because I got 11% of the votes in the general election. And so I went to law school because I thought, well, if that'll take 3 years, and when I finish, maybe people will have forgotten I ran against Congressman Brinkley. So I finished law school. I'm trying to get a job being a lawyer in Houston County, Georgia. I went to see every lawyer, and nobody would hire me. And they all said, we're not going to hire you because you ran against Brinkley, and we don't want to make him mad. I didn't know what was going to happen. I was getting real worried. I had a student loan. I was working while I was going to law school. I had to worry about passing my law school exams and passing the bar exam. And I had no chance of getting a job as far as I could tell. And one day I got home, and there was this handwritten letter from Congressman Brinkley. And I opened it, and a handwritten letter, and he said, when you finish law school, I want you to come to Washington and be my legislative assistant. I thought that was one of the biggest miracles I ever saw in my life. And I'd put that letter under the glass over our dresser, look at it every morning when I was getting dressed. And so when I finished law school, the next day, Julie and I, our two sons, drove up to Alexandria, Virginia, and rented a house. And I started working for Congressman Brinkley. And we used to go to eat lunch in the house restaurant in the Capitol, the house dining room. And one day we were walking back from there to the office, and we were just talking. And I said, you know, Congressman, you'll never know how much that letter meant to me. And I said, what really made it so special is you took the time to address the envelope by hand, and you wrote the letter by hand. And I said, you'll never know how much it meant to me that you were willing to do that. And he says, well, Dugan, I wouldn't think too much about that. And I said, why not? And he said, the only reason I wrote it by hand is because nobody in my office would type it for me.
Because they were mad with you for running against him, right?
They were mad. I had run against him. If I had won, they would all lost their jobs. So he said, the only reason I wrote it by hand, nobody would type it for me. I thought that was funny.
Yeah, and then later, I remember the story that made me chuckle. After all that, they were doing a roast about Jack Brinkley, and they called you to be the mystery guest or the mystery speaker. Talk about that a minute. I thought that was great.
Well, this, my philosophy of life is God sets all this stuff up. And if I look back at my life, I couldn't have done anything. God made all this stuff work. But while I was going to law school, after I'd run against him and got a whopping 11% votes,
And so let me put a comment there. Ed Swearingen from Reynolds, Georgia, who's my lifelong friend, was your campaign manager, right?
Yes, I feel bad for Edward to mention that he was my campaign manager.
He's a big Republican, has been forever. He was always active in politics.
I bet he regretted having done that, but Edward was a great guy.
Yeah, Edward did well. He started the Silver Dollar Raceway. I don't know whether you know that or not, and it was very successful. Has still going on. He sold it, but he's known by everybody in Georgia, I can promise you, with that Silver Dollar Raceway he had.
He was a wonderful person, and he was my campaign manager. But so it was while I was in law school, after I had run against Congressman Brinkley and got clobbered, and I got this call one day from the man who was the president of the Columbus Bank and Trust Company in Columbus, a man named Jim Blanchard. And he said, we're going to have a roast for Congressman Brinkley at the Springer Opera House. And he said, we want to know, would you come and be the mystery roaster? And I said, oh, yes, sir, that'd be great. So I went up there, and all I took with me was a tuxedo. And Julie and I had a hotel room, but I just brought a tuxedo and the clothes I used to drive in the car. So I go to this roast. Julie was pregnant with our second child. And the Columbus JCs put me in this little room because they didn't want anybody to see that I was there. And I'm in this little room, and they had just one person in there with me, and it's this member of the Columbus JCs. Well, the way I make talks is I never prepare them. I sort of get a feeling from the audience what they want to hear me talk about, and I'll talk to them about that. Well, if that's your style of public speaking, you'll make some great, great talks, and you'll also make some real bombs. And it's terrible when you have a bomb. But I'm in this room, and they had told me, they said, Senator Talmadge is going to make a talk, and right after him, we're going to bring you out. And I could hear Senator Talmadge talking to the crowd, and I couldn't think of anything to say. Nothing was coming to me. And I was getting nervous. And this guy from the Columbus JC said to me, what's wrong? I said, look, I can't think of anything to say. They're about to call me out there. I got nothing. And this guy says to me, well, let me ask you something. Are you going to run again? I just got my pants beat off. I got 11% of the votes. I was a human walking joke. I thought when this guy asked me, was I going to run again? I thought that was the funniest thing I ever heard in my life. And so I heard the applause. Senator Talmadge was through, and they were introducing me, and I had to walk out there, big crowd. The first thing I said was, I said, after that last election, I was a little discouraged. I said, but after hearing all these objective remarks about Congressman Brinkley and his career, I've decided I'm going to run again. Well, the whole place fell down laughing because it was so ridiculous. And after that, God gave me thing after thing to say that was funny. And the one thing I remember from that talk was I told this story. It just came to me. I said, after the election, I read in the paper that Congressman Brinkley's campaign manager was throwing a big dinner for him and all his supporters. I said, so I called my campaign manager, Edward Swearingen of Reynolds, Georgia. And I said, Edward, Congressman Brinkley's campaign manager is throwing a big dinner for him and all his supporters. Could you please throw a big dinner for me and all my supporters? And Edward said, I sure will. And I said, well, when can you do it? And Edward said, as soon as I can shoot a rabbit. And so,
what's funny, what's remarkable that you ran against him, you made them mad, you started going to law school, they called you to be a part of the roast, and then he brought you to Washington, his guy that ran against him. What a story. And you had a run in Washington with him. One of the things that hit me too while you were in Washington and Jimmy Carter was now president, you called the White House one day and he took your call. Talk about that. How you went over to see him.
I was up there in working for Congressman Brinkley, and I decided I wish I could go see President Carter. I didn't call the White House. What I did, was President Carter's cousin, Hugh Carter. When Jimmy Carter became governor, he ran for the state senate, and Hugh Carter became the state senator from Plains. And Hugh Carter's son was working for Jimmy Carter at the White House. So I called down to Plains to Senator Hugh Carter, and I told him I was up in Washington working for Congressman Brinkley, and I'd like to go talk to President Carter. And he said, okay, well, I'll call my son. And about an hour later, I got a call from President Carter's secretary, and she said, President Carter wants you to come over here. And she told me when he wanted me to come. And I went over there, and it's quite an amazing experience for me, and that was the first time. That's the first time I had seen him since that time Julie and I went to that farm when he was governor, and there he was in the Oval Office, and I was talking to him, and it was like no time had passed at all. And, Jimmy Carter's the kind of guy that if he likes you, he's going to always like you. There's almost nothing more important to President Carter than a friend, and that was just a wonderful God-sent experience for me because it reignited my relationship with President Carter.
You saw something in him that was very attractive, the fact that of all that had gone on, you'd resigned from his campaign, he invited you, he acted like nothing had ever happened, and he treated you as a friend. So at some point, you ended up getting out of Washington, and you moved back to Georgia. You got in a very dark place, and you tell a story. You ended up working as an assistant janitor, and you were literally cleaning toilets. So after all of this, and all of this political, you're now a lawyer. You've had all this experience. You sit in the office of the president. You've got a close relationship with a congressman, and now you're cleaning toilets. So just talk a minute about how you got to such a dark place.
Well, when Congressman Brinkley, he decided not to run for re-election in 1982. I thought he was going to run. He was talking to me about, we were practiced. One day he had me go eat lunch with him at the House dining room in the Capitol, and he said, let's just pretend I'm running for re-election and you're my opponent. He says, let's just debate some issues back and forth. So we did, and I was positive he was going to run for re-election, and the next Monday he called me the next Monday morning and said he wasn't going to run, but he wanted to know, did I want to run? And I said no, and then that was 82, and he said, why don't you go back now to Columbus and start working in my Columbus office for the rest of my term, and then we can be law partners. We can open a law practice. And so that's what we did. And, I worked for him. We worked together. And after a couple of years, my wife, her parents died, and she inherited a whole lot of money. I didn't understand the value of money. I was really, in a lot of ways, the biggest fool who ever lived. And I decided, okay, we'll just move to the beach. And we had been going to a place called Dauphin Island, Alabama. And we moved down there, and I thought we had enough money to do it. We built a nice house on Dauphin Island. It turned out I was wrong, and we were spending a lot more money than we were making on the interest on the money she inherited. But I realized it. I didn't want to tell my family about it because they seemed pretty happy living there. And so I thought, what can I do from Dauphin Island, Alabama to make the money we need? For some reason, I decided the thing I would do would be day trading in the stock market. And for the first year and a half, I made a lot of money doing that. But then I hit a bad trade and lost a lot of money. And when I did, I also lost my nerve. And once I lost my nerve, I started selling stock the first time it went down and taking a loss instead of making a profit. And before long, we went completely broke. Well, you can imagine how terrible and depressed I felt about that. And I tried to start practicing law, and then we moved back to Noonan, Julie's hometown, where I tried to practice law, and I just couldn't do good enough at it. I was so depressed. It was a very low time, and I guess I had a nervous breakdown, is the way to say it. And this young lady who I worked with her in Congressman Brinkley's office. She lived in Columbus, a wonderful person. And I called her and I said, man, we're in terrible shape. And she says, come over here and talk to my daddy. So Julie and I went to Columbus and talked to her daddy. And her daddy, he owned all these banks and all these businesses. And I thought, well, we'll go over here. And with my background, he'll probably ask me to be the branch manager of one of his banks. And we got over there and he listened to us. He was real nice. And he said, I'm going to get you a job at a local outreach center of the church in the poorest neighborhood in Columbus, Georgia. And he said, I'll get you a job being the assistant janitor. And he said, your wife can have a job working in the nursery at the same place. He says, you can find a house living with an old man who needs somebody to live with him to help take care of him. And he says, I'll pay for your medicine. I'll pay for you to go to the psychologist 3 times a week and the psychiatrist once every 2 weeks. He says, I'll pay for all that. And, he said, now you and Julie go eat lunch and think about it. And I would tell you the truth. I didn't realize how bad off I was. And I didn't like the idea of doing that too much. But I realized it was the only chance that we had to keep going. So we went back after lunch and told him we wanted to do that. So I started working at this place, and my job, they had about 18 bathrooms in the place, and there was one by the basketball court. There was a huge bathroom, and the kids who came in there to play basketball didn't get the concept of commodes or urinals. They thought the whole bathroom was the bathroom. Boy, it was fun to go in there pushing that cart with the cleaning supplies.
Unbelievable.
One day I got to the door to this gigantic restroom that was so incredibly nasty every time I went in, and something snapped in my head, and I said, devil, I hope you got the nastiest bathroom in history behind this door, because I'm going to show you nobody can stop me from doing what God wants me to do. And boy, after that, I attacked those bathrooms. I loved that job. Well, Jimmy Carter, he heard about this, and he sent word he was coming to this place one night the next week. And so the Secret Service pull up, and
was he a sitting president, or that was after he was out of office, I assume, right?
After he was president.
Right.
It was a few years after president. But he came over there, and the Secret Service brought him, and he got out, and they had me at the doorway, and it was just so special to see him.
Incredible.
He had over there to that place to see me. Well, he got in there, and there was a lot of people there because they knew he was coming, and somebody said to him, will you make a speech? And Jimmy Carter said, I will if Steve Dugan introduces me like he used to, because I used to introduce him once a week at a rally we had on Sunday afternoon for the campaign managers in Atlanta. So I got up there and I tried to introduce him like I used to. And, all I was thinking about was how much things had changed since the last time I introduced him. And I just sort of had trouble introducing him. I about broke up, but I got through it and introduced him. And boy, I can see the look in his eyes now. He walked over there. He grabbed me. He hugged me. He was so wonderful to me. And the first thing he said in that talk, he told those people, he said, I would have gone anywhere in the world to be introduced by Steve Dugan one more time. Wow. And a great man. What an absolutely wonderful Christian man to go out of his way to be so kind to me when I was in such a low place.
Incredible. Former president of the United States coming to a guy that now is not the janitor, but the assistant janitor.
That's right.
And making you, engaging you, and giving you that gift that I talk about to a lot of people, the gift of significance. That is a powerful gift that we all have the power to give away every day of our lives. And boy, what a touching story! What a touching story. So, your life after that, you started practicing law, and we won't get into all that. You were public defender, I think, down. You're living in Mobile area now, and you've been a public defender. Is there anything I missed there, Steve, that you would add?
The one thing I want to be sure to get into this is that things like this have convinced me that God has a plan for everybody's life, and that when whoever's listening to this, maybe one person listening to this is at a low point, and I want to let them know, be alert. That's when you'll see God. When you're at a low point, God will put a great person in your life who will do something to help you. God will help you when you're at your lowest point. And I want to just say, I love Jimmy Carter. I love Congressman Brinkley. They both went way out of their way to be gracious and nice to me when I needed people the most. My purpose in writing that book is I wanted people to know not about the things Jimmy Carter did or Congressman Brinkley did that were public information. I want them to know what wonderful people they were. They were really great people.
And we're all in this world, and we all have opportunities to touch other people in powerful ways, just as these guys touched you. So the book, Jimmy Carter and Friends, we're going to talk about all that in just a minute. You also wrote a book about your wife called 9 Words. Give us the 9 words. And your wife has been a pillar in your life. That was one decision and one thing you did right for sure. And so just talk about that briefly, or what that book's about, and we'll tell people how to get them.
Okay, well, that book is in 2021, about 11 or 12 years ago, I got diagnosed with Parkinsonism. And in 2021, I realized I wasn't going to be able to keep doing what I had been doing. And that Christmas, I prayed and asked God, what do you want me to do now? Because I needed to make some money and I needed something to do. And I thought the answer I got was write the story of the 9 words. Well, I knew exactly what that referred to, but it was a story I hadn't told many people. When I was 12 years old in Noonan, Georgia, I had this friend, and his girlfriend was named Julie Cole. And one night I was spending the night at his house, and he showed me a picture of this girl. And the minute I saw that picture, I just knew this was the greatest girl in the world, but I didn't know what to do about it. A couple of weeks later, I was at the top of the steps of the Noonan Junior High, and I was looking at girls getting in cars to get in carpools to go home because I was crazy about girls. I saw one girl who was pretty, but I could see right through her to the car she was standing in front of, and I thought that was strange. Then I moved my eyes to the left. I saw another pretty girl. I could see right through her to the car she was getting ready to get in. Then I moved my eyes left. I saw another pretty girl. I couldn't see through her. And I thought, that girl is solid. And what I meant was she had substance. And as soon as I thought that, I heard a voice say into my right ear, that is a wise girl. You should marry her. 9 words. I was 12 years old. I looked at that girl some more. I realized that was the girl in the picture at my friend's house. And I knew who that girl was. It was Julie Cole. Well, I went home, and that night after supper, I did something I never did any other day. And after supper, I went to my room and closed the door and lay down on my bed, and I prayed for over 2 hours. I didn't know what to make of this. I didn't know what to do about it. I was just 12. I prayed for over 2 hours that one day God would let me marry that girl. Well, it was later that year that our family moved from Noonan to Fort Valley. I wasn't lovesick about her or anything, but if I ever heard the word Julie on TV or in a movie, I immediately thought about that girl and those 9 words. And then when I graduated from high school, I went to college at Washington and Lee in Lexington, Virginia. I thought, Well, I must not be going to marry that girl because I'm going in the opposite direction of where she is. And that Christmas, I took the plane from Roanoke, Virginia to Atlanta to get back to Fort Valley. And there was another guy from Washington and Lee, and he lived in Noonan. And so when we got to Atlanta, I went down to the baggage claim section on the ground level of the Atlanta airport to get my bag. And there was Julie sitting there with this other guy's mama waiting to pick him up. And I recognized her, but I thought, I'm sure she doesn't know who I am. But I had to walk past her to get to my bag, and I just mumbled hello as I walked past. I can hear her voice right now. She said, "Hello, Steve." I couldn't believe she knew who I was. I couldn't believe she remembered my name. And after that, another miracle happened that led to us having our first date. And then Jimmy Carter comes back into it and helps us get married. So anyhow, that's when I thought God was telling me to write the story of the 9 words, I knew he wanted me to write the story of how he said those 9 words to me and the miracles he did during the next 8 years that led to us getting married.
Wow. So how important has she been in your life, Steve? Julie?
More important than everybody else and everything else put together multiplied by me.
Isn't that crazy? So you did hear God's voice, and where would you be without her? You got married because you thought God was telling you this is who you should marry, and that's a pretty good reason to get married. Can't think of a better one, right?
He didn't just tell me who to marry. He told me why. I mean, I could look at her and tell she was pretty. She looked just like I wanted a girl to look. I could figure that out. God didn't have to say, marry her. Hey, she's pretty. I could figure that out. God said, that is a wise girl. You should marry her. God knew that I was fairly smart, but I was also very foolish. And whatever he wanted me to do in my life, I was going to need a wise person. And, I tell this story to people. I tell them that in the pre-life, God called Mother Teresa and Julie over to him and flipped a coin. And Mother Teresa said heads, and God said, you win. You get to go to India and live with the lepers. And then he put his arm around Julie and said, I'm sorry, you got to marry Steve Dugan. And I really think that's what happened.
I love it. So the second book, the first book, Jimmy Carter and Friends, the second book, 9 words, this story about anybody's thinking about getting married, anybody that is married, you want to read it. It's a very interesting book of how God put them two together. And then you wrote a book, and I don't know what order you wrote these, doesn't matter, but spiritual truths, that great news from God. As you've lived in some tough places, you begin to share some spiritual truths you've learned. We won't go through all those lessons. You actually do an email, and I'm on your list now, where you send a spiritual lesson a day that comes out like at 2 a.m., so I know you're still sending. It's called Great News from God, and I know that there's some spiritual truths that has literally kept your head above water during some tough times, right?
Well, that's true. And that book, after I wrote the 9 words, when I wrote it, I thought this is going to be a bestseller. I'll never have any more money problems. They'll probably make a big movie out of this. And then the book came out, and I bought more copies than everybody else in the world put together, And on Amazon, they rank your book, and my book was in the top 13 million. It was toward the bottom of the 13 million. There it was, top 13 million books in the world. And I don't think that quite qualifies as a bestseller. Nobody buying the book. Nobody knew about the book. And I got depressed. And so I'd watch TV with Julie at night, and I thought that book was going to be the answer. And nobody's buying the book. And I got real depressed. And one night I was sitting here watching TV, and an idea popped into my head from out of nowhere. It said, read about the burning bush. And I paused the TV and got out the Bible and read about the burning bush. Well, I saw the connection between that and what happened to me, because before God talked to Moses, he did something to defy nature. He caused a bush to catch on fire but not be consumed. And that got Moses' attention, and then God told him what he wanted him to do. That reminded me of the 9 words, because before God talked to me, he defied nature by letting me look through those other 2 girls. So what that said to me was, just because nobody's buying your book, don't doubt that I said that to you, and don't doubt that I wanted you to write that book, because when I talked to you, I did the same thing I did when I talked to Moses. I defied nature to get your attention. So that encouraged me for about a month. Then I got discouraged again, and we were watching TV. It says, read about Elijah. And I remember I got out the Bible, paused the TV, and I'm going through the Old Testament looking for the book of Elijah. And I do it about 3 times, and I think, darn, I can't find the book of Elijah. Then I looked in the index, and there is no book of Elijah. But I found out the story of Elijah is in 1st and 2nd Kings, and I read it, and as depressed as I was, I read about this guy, Elijah. He got about 1,000 times as depressed as I did. Well, that encouraged me, because I thought, okay, so nobody's buying my book. I'm depressed, but look, here's a great guy from the Bible. He got more depressed than me. Every time I got real discouraged, something would pop into my head to read something in the Bible. So I told a friend of mine about this, and he said, make me a list of the things God told you to look up in the Bible, and just tell me what they were and what lesson you got out of them. I thought I'd send him a text message on the telephone, but when I got to writing it for him, I realized these stories are so long, they're not going to fit on a text message. So when I sent them to him, he says, you need to make a book with these things in it. And I thought, a book? I just spent a year writing a book, and nobody in the world wants to buy it. What a great idea. I'll write another book. I'll just kill all the trees I can kill. And so here I come with another book explaining how depressed I was. First book wasn't doing any good. So that didn't make much sense, but I did it. And so what can I say? It's just amazing.
So, folks, the book, Great News from God, if you need encouragement, if you're in a bad place, it's one lesson after another. It's worth reading. He could go on and on about these lessons. Steve, let me ask you this. As you look back on your life, you're, 74 years old?
Yeah.
What is the lesson of your life? What is the lesson that people can learn from you?
I would say, number one, God has a plan for everybody's life. It might not be the exact plan you wish it was, but God has a plan for everybody's life. That's lesson 1. Lesson 2, God is extremely merciful and loving and forgiving. And you might not feel like God's paying attention to you, but God's paying attention to everything you do. He knows everything birds do, and every time you cry, he's counting the tears. And so you just keep your faith, and God will get in touch with you.
When it's all said and done, Steve, what do you want people to remember about you?
I don't think there's much to remember about me. I think there's a lot to remember about my wife, and there's a lot to remember about Jimmy Carter, and there's a lot to remember about Jack Brinkley. And the thing to remember is, if you're a real Christian, you'll stick with people and love them when they're going through their worst time. And that, if you do that, God will be real happy with you.
Wow. So, folks, you've been listening to Steve Dugan. What a story. What an incredible story. He's written 3 books, one called Jimmy Carter and Friends, one called 9 words, and one called Great News from God. They're all available on Amazon. You can go to Amazon and order those books. Look up the name of the titles by Steve Dugan, Dugan. And if you got an ebook like me, or I got a Kindle, I downloaded all 3 of them and read all 3 of them in pretty short order, or you can order the actual books. I highly encourage you to do that. There's a lot of lessons in this. There's a lot of great stories. Just this whole thing, Jimmy Carter and Jack Brinkley, I couldn't get enough of it. I mean, it was incredible stuff about them and behind-the-scenes stuff that you would never read and you would never know. But he saw a lot more than we talked about today, for sure. And then these great spiritual lessons and his wife and the lessons that when you're discouraged. Folks, I highly encourage you to go to Amazon and go look him up. You can also follow Steve on Facebook, and you want to see these lessons, he'll sign you up. But he posts stuff on there at SteveDugan. I'm sure he'll accept you as a friend. Steve, thank you so much for doing this. This has been an honor for me to catch up with you after a long time. And I remember you. I remember when you ran for Congress. I lost touch with you, but I remember you well, and it's been an honor for me to have you on this podcast.
Well, it was really an honor for me, and I thank you, and I'm real proud of you. You've made Fort Valley High School proud with all the things you've done, and I'm honored you would give me this opportunity.
God bless you, Steve.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.